How the South Won the Civil War by Heather Cox Richardson barely talks about the South or the Civil War. It might be surprising to the average YouTube viewer that books written by scholars use their own form of clickbait sometimes, but that happens. This book is actually about the development of oligarchy in the American West and how that history somehow makes the Republican Party of today, and specifically Donald Trump, the heirs of the political legacy of the antebellum South. This book is not really meant to inform the reader about the Civil War or the American West, where it spends most of its time. It is meant to persuade the reader of certain modern political views and only informs them about history to the degree it supports those views. Well, according to Richardson, oligarchy needs a few things to develop. Specifically, an extractive economy. This is an economic structure where it is almost impossible for the average person to build wealth, but a person that is already rich can invest in the region and increase their wealth through exploitative practices. This is obviously going to produce a lot of economic inequality and class conflict, but to get around this, oligarchs will racialize class disputes by essentially telling white people that they are better than other races and that the demands of other races for equality is ultimately evidence of their desire to steal from the white man for their own personal gain. By doing this, oligarchs gain political support among the white majority, which gives them the political influence necessary to disenfranchise racial minorities and secure their political power. According to Richardson, this process played out in both the American South and West. This view of how oligarchy develops is misleading. For example, in the American West, even though the region was an extractive economy, racism developed due to the biases that white settlers already had, but also due to the genuine competition for economic opportunity in a region that was often hyped up more than it deserved. The idea of oligarchs racializing class disputes to establish power ultimately comes from the history of Jamestown, Virginia, where this is exactly what white planters did to deal with social unrest. However, the economy of the American South only became extractive after all the easy-to-develop land was bought up by the slave owners. Before that happened, it was as easy to make your own way there as it was in the North. So in the South, the pyramid of oligarchic development was completely inverted, where what Richardson sees as the foundation of oligarchy was only a result of it. And furthermore, Richardson doesn't analyze the northern oligarchs of the Gilded Age, and even though her book stretches to the modern day, she also ignores the potential development of a technology-based oligarchy on the modern West Coast, which would be based on ideals of equality and inclusion. These omissions are extremely relevant to her topic and seriously harm her credibility. And the second aspect of her argument is a political genealogy, which shows that the oligarchy which developed in the South and West is ultimately the same ideology that the modern Republican Party pushes. The idea here is that the South would influence the Constitution and use it to reinforce its ideals of racism, slavery, oligarchy, and white supremacy. These ideals would then go on to influence the West, and then these two would come together in a political alliance after the Civil War ended. This political alliance would exist across party lines for decades until after World War II. At that point, Western and Southern politicians came together to create a new ideology, movement conservatism. The supporters of this ideology would then attempt to take over the Republican Party, and they would put forward their own presidential candidate in the 1960s, Barry Goldwater, who was seen as the first presidential candidate of this ideology. And Barry Goldwater, he failed horribly. He only won the Deep South in Arizona. But after him, Ronald Reagan would make movement conservatism and therefore racism a core part of the Republican platform. And then Donald Trump, a person who does show himself as a new Reagan, is seen as a president which put oligarchy, racism, and demagoguery in the White House. And therefore, I guess you shouldn't vote Republican. And unfortunately, I'm not exaggerating her argument. It is the case that she does bring forth a lot of evidence to support her views, but she fails to consider very important questions that fundamentally destroy her argument. That is the question of what is the influence behind the modern Democratic Party, and does the abolitionist influences of the early Republican Party still influence the party today? These questions are ignored almost entirely throughout her book. And ultimately, she doesn't paint anything other than a partisan picture of why the other side is bad and why you shouldn't support them.